94% of Japanese women own at least a Louis Vuitton bag. Do you think China would get that level?
No, I think one of I think the long run issue for China.
What's the general story of online to offline business around the world?
Majority of firms have quite significant separation between their on and offline activities. So how do they bring the two together? They find that very, very hard to do.
在持续的反腐和经济增长放缓的双重压力之下，中国奢侈品市场的增长正在放缓，但市场也并非死水一滩。今天我们请到的是英国经济学人集团智库的负责人 Robin Bew 先生，让我们来听一听，在他和他所接触的诸多跨国企业管理者眼中，中国市场正在发生着什么样的变化？
在刚刚过去的双11，年轻奢侈品品牌的交易量显示了强劲增长。而二手奢侈品的交易量也显著上升，和数年前一窝蜂的购买顶级奢侈品品牌相比，中国消费者的口味正在发生变化。对于全球化的奢侈品公司来说，中国的市场变化非常值得关注。
So EIU recently published a report on China's luxury market.
That's right.
Yeah. So very briefly, what's the general trend you discovered?
We're very optimistic about luxury in China. So if we look at what's happening here, we see this still tremendous strength at the very top end for the most exclusive brands, and a lot of the clients that we have in the rest of the world, and for that particular part of the market, a lot of those clients are actually French clients or Swiss clients, so watches, very expensive, high-end consumer luxuries. They still see a lot of opportunity here.
But actually, your report actually mentioned the big brands are kind of slowing the pace of store opening. Actually, with the anti-corruption campaign started last year, the market is being affected in a significant way. And I actually have some statistics here from Bain, which estimates China's personal luxury sales, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau, actually fell. The growth rate actually fell from 30% in 2011 to 7% in 2012 and 3% in 2013.
That's true. The gifting part of the equation has changed quite markedly. So we see that gifting's happening in a different way now. What we see now is much more purchase for personal use. So that's becoming a much more important part of the market. And of course, China is still very significant in terms of the overall market share. So I guess the interesting thing for our clients is that China remains a dominant player in terms of purchases. But it's absolutely true. The corruption squeeze has absolutely put a brake on particular sorts of luxury spending, the things that were used for gifting or the things that were used in entertaining.
So what are the Louis Vuittons or Kering's strategy right now?
I can't talk about specific companies, but I think there's a few things. There's certainly this idea about geographic expansion, so opportunities in other parts of the country where we're starting to see more significant disposable income, so that's important. I think companies are still trying to work out how this corruption squeeze is going to have an impact on them on the long run. So there's a question about, well, is this going to be maintained and what would the impact be? Well, I think the really interesting issue is around this less conspicuous consumption and this move towards buying for own use. Those things are big issues for luxury firms that they're very focused on, is about this switch.
中国居民收入迅速增长是奢侈品品牌决策的关注点，但对于具体的品牌来说，未来影响其销售的因素又有不同。结合阶段性的政策走向，奢侈品品牌的中国策略充满了不确定性。
So it is rumored that almost 94% of Japanese women own at least a Louis Vuitton bag. Do you think China would get that level?
No, I think one of I think the long run issue for China, and this is less about luxury than about the future of the Chinese economy, is that China faces some significant longer term economic challenges, mainly around the population. So the population here is going to shrink quite significantly because of the impact of the one-child policy. Now, obviously, that's been changed now, but the demographics take a long time to respond to that. We do see living standards are rising very quickly, but our longer term projections do not suggest that on average the Chinese household is going to attain Japanese or US style living standards any time in the next 20 or 30 years. So unfortunately, the average Chinese woman is unlikely to own a Louis Vuitton handbag. It will remain a niche, important niche, but nonetheless a niche purchase.
Which would be good for Chinese and good for Louis Vuitton.
Yes.
One factor which is important for China's luxury market is the extent of great income. There is one Chinese scholar did extensive research on this last year, basically concluding about 12% of China's GDP went into great income.
But we actually thought it was a little bit higher than that. And the other thing is because we looked at two things. We looked at grey income, we also looked at grey wealth, so wealth that was not captured. So we actually think it's a little bit higher than that. I think the trend is for that to continue to grow and grow quite rapidly. That and we see this in other countries around the world as well. But the reality is that when you look at the disparity between spending patterns and reported income, it's clear there is quite a significant gap, and that has been a very important driver of luxury, particularly because when you have grey income, buying things which do not require huge amounts of paperwork and contracts and stuff, that becomes very important, and luxury is an area where you can do that.
And is anti-corruption campaign kind of diminishing part of it?
Well, at the moment the anti-corruption campaign seems to be largely around bribery, and that's a part of grey income, but actually that doesn't seem to us to be the main. Most of grey income across the country as a whole seems to be more about undeclared businesses than bribery.
2013年，大量中国零售品牌开始打出 O2O 的旗号，但刚刚过去的双11给 O2O 概念泼了一盆冷水。电商的本质是纯线上交易 ，O2O 更强调线上线下的结合。零售业的这种趋势会影响到更广泛的 O2O 应用吗？
One difference in China is China's online retail grow very fast, and there is even the famous bet between two prominent Chinese businessmen, Jack Ma and Wang Jianling of Wanda Group, betting whether by 2022 the total online sales will exceed 50% of overall retail sales. What's your bet?
That would be quite astonishing if it was true. I think I can't think of any other country in the world where you see anything like that. And when we talk to companies here which are in the retail industry in China, actually we see some interesting things here which you don't see elsewhere. Actually, in China, that bit of the market they found it very difficult to make inroads there. That the consumer, the foodstuffs, much more interest, but in consumer durables, they found it much more difficult. And there's a cultural thing associated with that. But I think in China, when people go to buy a television or something like that, they often want to be there physically to inspect it. And so I'm a bit sceptical that you could see online trade grow to that kind of market share over that sort of time scale. But it's certainly true that in China you are seeing certainly supermarket type shopping moving online very quickly. So that's been important.
There are several Chinese online retailers moving abroad. Alibaba is moving to France, and the recently listed retailer Jingdong actually went to the US as well. Do you think they will succeed on foreign soil?
I think Alibaba is obviously actually is a reasonably well-known brand in the West already. So they're getting closest to having established a global brand. I think for those firms, like all other businesses operating overseas, there's a challenging learning experience that most, in general, Chinese firms do not have a lot of experience operating internationally. There's not. Chinese firms are moving abroad in much greater numbers now. The government is encouraging that very explicitly, but there's still not the stock of knowledge. So I think the firms you just mentioned, they have a strong business model. They compete on price, and I think that's a so that's a skill that they can take into foreign markets and perhaps deploy very effectively. But the challenges of managing overseas, about building the appropriate networks of stakeholders and relationships, I mean, those things are demanding. So I think it's certainly, you can't be confident that they will succeed.
One thing we see in China recently popping up is the online to offline business model, which attract a lot of attention and interest from Chinese online retailers or businessmen. What's the general story of online to offline business around the world? What's the status of that?
You mean ordering online to collect in store? Yeah, that has become quite important. I think one of the things that when we talk to retailers in the rest of the world, they struggle to connect their on and offline experiences. So they found it very difficult. But they often end up competing against themselves between the two different sides of the business. So bringing those two things together has, for firms that have managed to achieve it, has been very successful. So we have some brands in the UK where they've managed to do that, where they have a retail network and they're able to effectively use that as a distribution channel for their online sales. But still, I would say the majority of firms have quite significant separation between their on and offline activities. And generally within their strategic decision making, they struggle to see how you can bring those two together and make sense of it. I mean, the reality is that, of course, the operating costs of the offline store network is very high, but yet there's a sense that most of the revenues are still being driven through that channel, and so how do they bring the two together? They find that very, very hard to do.
在 Robin 看来，马云很难打赢与王健林的赌局。根据他的经验，即使在英美等发达国家，线上零售占社会零售总额的比例也不到10%。中国市场会不会是个例外？在零售行业，线上线下谁能胜出？中国零售业的转型升级，值得人期待。